Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Laura Brush, the Resilience Fellow here at C2ES, and I want to thank you for joining us today for our webinar, Building for Tomorrow, Jobs, Climate, and Resilient Infrastructure. And this is a particularly timely discussion. As many of you know, in March, President Biden released his American Jobs Plan, which would invest more than $2 trillion to modernize the nation's infrastructure. With Congress now shifting their focus in the coming months to infrastructure legislation, there's renewed interest in the need to upgrade the nation's transportation, waterway, power, broadband, and building and housing infrastructure. Here at C2ES, we think it's critical that both new and existing infrastructure is designed or upgraded to be resilient, which will help the communities that these assets serve to be more resilient in a changing climate. For those not familiar with C2ES, we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank that brings together diverse interests to find solutions for our climate and energy challenges. We work with policymakers from the local to the federal levels, as well as businesses to reduce greenhouse gases, deploy clean energy, and build resilience to the impacts of climate change. On the last point, resilience has come to mean different things to different groups. We at C2ES define climate resilience as the ability to anticipate, prepare for, and respond to hazardous events, trends, or disturbances related to climate. Improving climate resilience involves assessing how climate change will create new or alter current climate-related risks and taking steps to better address them. In today's webinar, we'll be focusing on how infrastructure projects can make the United States more resilient to climate impacts. So why now? Why resilience? You'll be hearing more about the costs of deteriorating infrastructure from our next speaker, but I wanted to highlight some climate impacts and what's at stake if we fail to sufficiently upgrade and repair our infrastructure, as well as the benefits that climate resilience can provide. So in 2020, according to NOAA, the United States experienced 22 natural disasters that caused more than $1 billion in damages each, breaking the previous annual record of 16 events that occurred in 2017 and 2011. These billion-dollar extreme weather events in 2020 exceeded a cumulative cost of $96 billion, which is the fourth highest U.S. cost since 1980. And while 2020 was a record-breaking year in terms of the number of extreme weather events, the United States has seen and continues to see a growing number of billion-dollar disasters. From 1980 to 2020, there's been an average of 7 disasters each year causing at least $1 billion in damage. However, in the last 5 years, from 2016 to 2020, the annual average was 16. As the latest National Climate Assessment explores, in the next century, we can expect more extreme weather and record-breaking years, as well as smaller scale and chronic events that still cause significant damages. Global sea level rise is causing accelerated incidences of daily tidal flooding along the Atlantic coast, and the frequency and intensity of extreme heat and heavy precipitation and wildfire is also increasing. And as we all know and have seen, many parts of the country are rebuilding infrastructure damaged by recent extreme weather, along with addressing the backlog of upgrades and repairs that are already needed. The failure of infrastructure events during events like the recent Texas winter storm has highlighted not only the impacts of climate-related severe weather on safety and lives, but also the economic impacts that these disasters can have on our communities. The good news, though, is that actions to increase the resilience of our communities can not only avoid economic damages, but help cities realize economic gains, as C2ES explored in our recent report, The Resilience Factor, a competitive edge for climate-ready cities. These benefits can include increased tax revenues, new job markets and opportunities for workforce expertise, and improved livability, all of which can attract new residences and businesses while protecting ones that are already there. With the once-in-a-generation opportunity now upon us for significant infrastructure investment and bipartisan interest in these issues, we have the opportunity to upgrade infrastructure to extend its service life and avoid future damages which all better serves our communities and local economies. Some of C2ES's policy priorities for infrastructure include modernizing and building a resilient grid that can better distribute renewable power and help make communities resilient to climate impacts. Codifying the federal flood risk management standard to reduce flood risk by requiring the use of protective design standards, as well as forward-looking climate science for federally funded infrastructure projects. Prioritizing funding for proactive, meaning pre-disaster resilience planning and projects, especially in low-income communities and communities of color. And creating a national climate risk information system to increase the accessibility and usability of federal sources of climate data. C2ES is currently developing a report, including these priorities and others, and with support from the Bank of America, that will outline a vision for federal policy that better supports our communities in becoming more resilient. Today, we're going to discuss the opportunity for resilient infrastructure, lessons learned from prior infrastructure and resilience projects, as well as criteria to guide resilient infrastructure legislation, as well as future projects. And we're fortunate to be joined by a terrific panel today. First up is Emily Feenstra. Emily is the Managing Director of Government Relations and Infrastructure Initiatives at the American Society of Civil Engineers. In that role, she leads the division responsible for government affairs, media relations, and infrastructure policy for the Society, including their infrastructure report card and the Failure to Act economic study series. Next, we'll have Katrina Lewis. Katrina is a senior consultant and sustainability lead for AECOM's energy practice. Leveraging her background in economics and public policy, she leads, researches, and implements sustainability and resilience initiatives across the United States. And last but not least, we'll have Leo Barrera. Leo is the Director of Government and Public Affairs at Lafarge Holcim. In this capacity, Leo oversees Lafarge Holcim's federal and state advocacy work. He also works across the business to ensure Lafarge Holcim operations have robust community engagement strategies and helps implement the company's environment, social, and governance initiatives. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. There will be time for Q&A towards the end of the webinar. Please type your questions into the Q&A portion of Zoom, and we'll try to answer them at the very end of the presentations. We'll also be recording this webinar, which will be made available on our YouTube page within 24 hours. And with that, I will hand it over to Emily.
Great. Thank you, Laura, and thanks to the team at C2ES for having me this afternoon. I think I'm going to do a little bit of table setting for our discussion, if you will, and talk about the state of the nation's infrastructure, funding needs, and where we go from here at a high level. So, as Laura mentioned, I'm with the American Society of Civil Engineers. For those of you that aren't familiar, ASCE is the nation's oldest engineering society. We've been around since 1852. We've got 150,000 members across the country and around the globe, serving as stewards of the nation's infrastructure and leading advocates for sustainable infrastructure. And so our members work on everything from ports to the electric grid, dams, levees, transportation, water, you name it, when it comes to physical infrastructure assets, and increasingly broadband and fiber as well. So a little bit of background on the report card. You might be familiar, we have been releasing the infrastructure report card actually since 1998, every 4 years. That predates my time at ASCE, but it was actually first done by ASCE as a 10-year follow-up to a congressional report on the state of the nation's public works. And really, this is not for our own members. It is based on sound data and methodology and analysis, but it's meant for non-engineers and a policymaker audience. We boiled down all of the data into 5-page chapters or so across those 17 categories. And really at its heart, it's about taking what has traditionally been an out of sight, out of mind issue for most Americans, the drinking water pipes under their feet, the bridges they travel over each day, and trying to bring that to the forefront and into the conversation. And I think through the work of many stakeholders, we have seen infrastructure enter the mainstream conversation. It's been an exciting time, and our most recent report card was released. It's always released kind of at the start of a new administration. This one came out in March, and then it was exciting to see the American Jobs Plan come out soon after, and just see nightly news reports continuing on what we do about our infrastructure. Next slide. So a little bit of background on how we put together the report. We have a committee on America's infrastructure made up of association members, pretty senior level within their field, that we can cover those 17 categories. And they are not going out and inspecting every bridge and water system, but they are poring over, analyzing ideally federally available public data wherever possible. So, information from US DOT and the Bureau of Transportation Statistics, EPA, et cetera. We also go out and meet with industry groups, but we are assessing each category according to the 8 criteria that you see here. We have had resilience as a criteria for a couple cycles now, but really made a concerted effort this time to get better data and key indicators on how is our infrastructure doing when it comes to being climate resilient and an ability to bounce back from major events. And to some extent, our ability to evaluate that is based on how the industry and agency owners are evaluating themselves. So for an example, we saw some good movement in the water utility space, with utilities often located in low-lying flood-prone areas. They're doing their own assessments and reports on what their vulnerabilities are to climate change, continued flooding, and perhaps even things like siting, their electrical systems out of those flood-prone areas, making sure their backup generators are not only hardened to extreme heat, but extreme cold. That was an issue we saw in Houston, Texas, with the tragedy that unfolded there. So we are, like many others, looking at how we can get data to assess the resilience category. Next slide. So here are the grades that came out in March 2021 for our nation's infrastructure. A little bit of positive news to start. For the first time in 20 years, our overall GPA for our nation's infrastructure got out of the D's. It rose to a C- in 2021. You can see the green arrows on the screen are the grades that went up from 4 years ago. That included aviation, drinking water, energy, inland waterways, ports, and a few reasons that we saw in general. I won't have time to go into each category, but some trends that we saw across the grades were a greater handle on asset management, using technology to pinpoint leaks and deficiencies in the system and target limited funding to make those improvements. Continued appetite at the state and local level for increased investment in infrastructure. We saw an astounding, really 94% of local ballot initiatives for infrastructure pass in the most recent fall elections. And then some federal funding as well. While we haven't had the big infrastructure bill that's been talked about for years quite yet, we have seen some progress in areas such as ports and inland waterways. Finally, we have an ability to use the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund, for example, for dredging at our nation's ports, and an increase in the Inland Waterways Trust Fund. So there were some progress in some sectors as well. On the flip side, as a parent, and I'm sure many of you are parents, and just the obvious that a C- grade is nothing to jump up and down about. We still have a lot of work to do. And in fact, there's 11 grades still stuck in that D range. And there are some categories that we saw where data is still a large issue. For example, in dams and levees, we're still getting condition information and location information on thousands of miles of our nation's levees. School facilities as well. There is not an updated national database, nor in many cases a state level information on the nation of our school facilities. So issues to overcome here. The lowest grade you can see was for transit at a D- once again. There's still 45% of Americans that lack access to transit. They have a pretty huge maintenance backlog, and that's been exacerbated by the pandemic as they saw their revenues drop significantly, an average of 90%. Aging fleets, projects, and a lot of these legacy systems in the Northeast that have gone unfunded. So work to do there as well. Next slide. The other major news that people tend to focus on in addition to the grades is our investment needs chart across those 17 categories. And I should have mentioned stormwater was our new category for 2021, recognizing that flooding is a growing issue for so many communities, due in large part to climate change. We wanted to give people a better understanding of what stormwater is, what the solutions are out there, and kind of the disparate nature of who's responsible for stormwater issues, what the funding sources are, and what some solutions are for moving forward. So here, when you look at the investment needs chart, a lot of numbers, but the one perhaps to focus on is in that lower right-hand corner. That's the funding gap between what we estimate at ASCE the total needs are across those 17 categories, and then estimated expected funding, not just at the federal level, but at the state and local level as well. So that number, this is a 10-year gap. It's risen slightly to 2.59 or so trillion over a 10-year period. It was 2.1 trillion when we did the last assessment in 2017. The reason for some of that growth, the surface transportation number has stayed around the same at slightly under half of the gap. But when you look at the water, wastewater, stormwater categories, those numbers have gone up pretty dramatically in terms of total needs. I mentioned earlier that they are getting a better assessment of some of their resilience needs. So as we get a better understanding of our condition and our some of the issues that we might face and risks moving forward, those total needs numbers have gone up. We also did some, I'll call normalizing of some of the EPA data to take into account population growth in their clean water needs survey and drinking water needs surveys. And then finally, that addition of stormwater was some percentage of the growth there as well. The other total needs number that went up was in the dams category. We have an increasing number of high hazard dams in this country. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're unsafe, but it does mean that we're seeing perhaps dams that used to protect farmland and now protect a residential development. So as the property downstream of the dam becomes more valuable and there's a greater risk of loss of life, then they move into that high hazard dam category. And that means they need more attention, more inspections and more enforcement, which can be hard for state agencies to manage. Next slide. So we were getting the question from Capitol Hill and some lawmakers some time ago about, when especially with grades in the Ds, people would say, well, so what? So what does this mean for the economy? It's nice to think about doing something about infrastructure, but there's a lot of kicking the can down the road. So we set out to answer that question in economic terms of what does it do to our nation's economy to kind of have this status quo investment where we see kind of gradual wear and tear and gradual deterioration on our systems. There's certainly crises that pop up, like the bridge we've heard about this week in Memphis, but by and large, we're kind of treading water. So with a team of economists, we've estimated that the average American household loses about $3,300 a year due to this kind of deficient, unreliable infrastructure. And those are things you know intuitively, but might not be able to quantify. So, the repeated hitting the pothole on the road that needs a pavement upgrade, the water main break that shuts down a business for hours or days at a time, or the electrical blackout. Texas was a stark example of that, but any kind of blackout that shuts down a business or spoils food in the fridge, all those things add up and cost money. And $3,300 a year is about $63 a week, which in pandemic terms is a takeout dinner for a family of four. And so we found that this number is used just as much as our total needs number now, because it's something that people can understand. Next slide. While they don't get as much attention as the grades, certainly, we have always included pretty robust set of policy recommendations with our report card. And I'm giving very much the Cliff Notes version here, but would encourage you, when you have time, to take a look at infrastructurereportcard.org. There are robust chapters to peruse. There's state maps, state fact sheets, and these detailed policy recommendations across the 17 categories. But at the highest level, we talk about 3 key solutions, including leadership and action. We've seen a lot of state and local leadership. We believe we need a strong federal partner as well. Investment, when it comes to the percentage that we spend as a nation of our GDP on infrastructure investment, it's kind of dropped to around 2.5%, while other countries spend much more. We'd like to see that rise to around 3.5%. And then finally, this bucket on resilience. And in addition to our work on the report card and advocacy, we're actually a professional and technical society, and we spend a lot of time doing standard setting. And been pleased to see a lot more interest in some of our standards to make our infrastructure more resilient. Things like wind loads, tsunami, snow loads, taking into account the latest climate information. We'd like to see those incentivized in legislation and adopted. Next slide. And just to go into that a little bit further, some of the things that we talk about when it comes to resilience is using new approaches, materials, and technology, enabling communities to develop their own resilience pathway for their portfolios. Again, just even seeing the recent example in Texas, we have a member that runs Houston Public Works, and she talked about, it wasn't in their scenario planning for an extreme cold event like that, and they had their backup generators. We're not prepared for extreme cold, so that actually shut down her water utility, and giving some technical assistance and training and incentives for communities to think through all those scenarios as these extremes become more frequent. As I mentioned, incentivizing the use of codes and standards, consensus-based codes and standards, because a lot of times we do know we have the tools already in place to build our infrastructure or retrofit existing infrastructure to withstand some of these impacts. We do silo, of course, the report card categories in order to give them a grade, but we've done a lot of papers and discussion on talking about infrastructure as a system of systems. And I always like to talk about the ports category, and ports is really just, as strong as their weakest link. And that includes things like the roads and rail that connect to the port. If they're in poor condition, the port can't function optimally. Looking at sea level rise around ports and what that is doing to their facilities. So increasingly, as much as we can do to look at these systems holistically, to co-locate activity and construction where possible. And then improving land use planning, going back to the dams example, knowing where the nation's dams are and their condition. Should we be building that housing development downstream of a vulnerable dam? Thinking through some of those questions now and the investments that we're making, and what those long-term O&M costs are will be critical. And then finally, enhancing resilience of infrastructure using a combination of green and gray. And our stormwater chapter does a nice job of looking at all sorts of solutions, from detention basins to green roofs and green infrastructure as a way to combat the stormwater issues that we're facing. Next slide. So again, a very brief primer on some of the issues that we uncovered in our latest assessment of the nation's infrastructure. I think it's kind of a basic point that sometimes gets overlooked, but really focusing on maintaining what we have, maintaining our existing assets, because as we face these more extreme events, the assets that we have that are vulnerable, that are fragile, that haven't been maintained the way they should. Just if you had, built a house, your roof 30 years ago and didn't do any maintenance on that roof, it's going to be more fragile and vulnerable to increased storms. So that's this fix it first is something we've been focused on at ASCE, and we think can be part of the solution moving forward.
All right, great. Thanks, Emily, so much for setting the stage for us and talking about not only the gaps, but the opportunities for infrastructure. I want to remind everyone to please submit questions through the Q&A function of Zoom. And with that, I will turn to Katrina.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. As Laura mentioned, my name is Katrina Lewis, and I'm a senior consultant with AECOM's energy team. For those of you who aren't familiar with AECOM, AECOM is a global professional services firm providing sustainability, integrated design, planning, engineering, environment, and program management services across a broad range of markets. Our purpose is to enhance and sustain the world's built natural and social environments, and we do this across 150 countries with a team of over 56,000 dedicated and specialized staff. And at AECOM, planning, designing, building, and operating resilient infrastructure is central to the work we do. So I'd like to share with you today are a few examples of that work that I think actually really embody some of the concepts that Emily was just talking about how we need to think about our future infrastructure. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. So specifically, I want to walk you through 4 unique approaches to land, infrastructure, buildings, and job training aimed at building a more climate resilient future. This includes work from places like Chicago, Boston, and Argonne National Laboratory in Illinois. Each of these examples demonstrates a different way that organizations and institutions are changing the way they think about their buildings, the infrastructure they're maintaining or revitalizing, and programming in order to better prepare for a changing climate reality. Next slide. So first, let's go to Chicago, where the City of Chicago Department of Planning and Development, in partnership with local community partners, took an innovative approach to reimagining city-owned vacant lots for community benefit. Funded through a Department of Housing and Urban Development grant and building on resilience planning that was spurred by some significant rainfall events back in 2013, this project was able to construct 10 stormwater landscapes along 3 corridors in Chicago's west side. The areas were selected due to frequent negative impacts of urban flooding that these communities were experiencing, things like basement backups or street flooding that made travel difficult. The goal of these sites were not only to alleviate the negative impacts of large rainfall events, which are expected to get more prevalent in the region based on the impacts from climate change, but also to activate new community spaces and provide community programming. The sites were designed and programmed in partnership with the community and included the design of features like a permeable pavement basketball court and a production garden for an agricultural incubator training program. The impacts of these sites, both from a stormwater management perspective and a community impact perspective, are being monitored to better understand how programs such as this can be leveraged for diverse community benefits. Again, how can infrastructure provide more than just its primary benefit of, say, managing stormwater, but additional benefits for the community, like providing a space for children to come play and be safe after school. The city is actively working on actually deploying a second phase of this work to construct an eco-orchard in the East Garfield Park neighborhood. And it's successes from projects like this that demonstrate how communities and city governments can work together to address community challenges while also enhancing community resilience, investing in infrastructure, and revitalizing communities. Next slide. So thinking about how development within communities can help to build a more resilient tomorrow, I wanted to talk about another example where this is really core, which was AECOM's work in Boston, developing the Boston Smart Utilities vision. In Boston, the city, which had recently faced some challenges in areas that had been having quick development, areas like the Seaport District, they wanted to understand what types of technologies or improved designs they should be incorporating into major redevelopments in order to create more resilient communities. So as they were watching these investments happening in neighborhoods, they wanted to understand what should we be thinking about and doing now so that we're ready for the changes from climate change and creating stronger communities at the same time. To do this, they selected a pilot area along South Dorchester Avenue, where they expected significant growth and redevelopment in the coming years. They built off a base of a recently completed master plan and compared how infrastructure would typically be built to support the type of growth they expected. They compared that to, well, what is a new way we could do this that would integrate technologies and be more resilient? And they compared the types of technologies they should integrate to support climate resilience, efficiency and affordability, and other community goals. The project team looked at integrating technologies like solar PV, district energy systems and microgrids, green stormwater infrastructure, smart mobility and pedestrian safety sensors, and a common utility tunnel for more equitable fiber expansion. The impacts of these technologies were modeled based on proposed development scenarios. Diagrams were created to represent how these systems could be integrated into both existing street networks and new street networks. And then recommendations were made to pilot a new policy to support the integration of smarter technologies into new developments. As a result of this work, the Smart Utilities Policy for Article 80 development review was created and requires the integration of 5 different smart utility technologies into what are classified as Article 80 projects based on different development thresholds. What this represents is how analysis on the resilience impacts of technologies can help inform policy development that support new ways of doing things and encourage private developers to integrate forward-thinking technologies that can improve community resilience. Solving these challenges can't be solely on the shoulders of city entities, like in the Chicago example, but also need to involve private developers and the community themselves in order to have long-term success. Next slide. Another organization thinking seriously about its long-term ability to meet climate and resilience-related goals is Argonne National Labs. At AECOM, we've been supporting Argonne in accelerating their decarbonization of its Illinois campus. Using AECOM's proprietary Rosetta tool, we're establishing what's known as a digital twin of the site that allows us to model different decarbonization pathways and scenarios. Following a simple process of documenting the current conditions, defining the future goals, identifying opportunities, and then creating a roadmap to achieve those goals, Argonne is able to identify early some of the barriers and challenges they will face in attempting to achieve a net zero campus. These challenges include the need for broader utility grid decarbonization, balancing the need for investment in mission-critical projects with the need to reduce site emissions, and pulling together stakeholders across the organization to think about how investments today impact the site's future resilience and its ability to reach net zero. These challenges are not unique to Argonne or research campuses. And by looking at how campuses like Argonne and others throughout the country are planning to overcome these types of challenges, we can better prepare the broader community for a decarbonized future and a more resilient and building of more resilient infrastructure. Next slide. In the last few examples, I've discussed planning, projects, technology solutions to support a climate resilient future. However, building for tomorrow really requires more. While decarbonization and electrification create tremendous opportunities for the economy, the environment, and public health improvements, it does depend on having a highly trained and diverse STEM workforce to support the future investments. A great example of work to advance the development of this workforce is AECOM's partnership with Chicago City Colleges. Together, we are helping to decarbonize City Colleges buildings while creating an innovative STEM programming that will train the future workforce through both curriculum development and internships, including several internships with AECOM. In addition to this work, the team has a pending grant request which would allow us to integrate advanced technologies into City Colleges buildings to make the buildings interactive with the grid, allowing them to both more quickly decarbonize and be more resilient, as well as create further advanced training for students as you think about how these technologies become more commercial and more scaled throughout the US. Through these four examples, I hope to have demonstrated the different approaches organizations are taking to advancing their ability to support a more resilient future. And of course, I look forward to answering any questions you have later on in the panel.
Thank you, Katrina, for painting a picture of what resilient infrastructure looks like at the local level. I will now turn to Leo from Lafarge-Holcim.
Thank you, Laura. It's an honor to be here with you today to discuss Building for Tomorrow. My name is Leo Barrera, and I'm the Director of Government and Public Affairs at Lafarge-Holcim. For those of you that don't know Lafarge-Holcim, we're a global building materials company with operations in over 70 countries in the United States. We have close to 9,000 employees in over 40 states, and we boast the distinction of being the largest cement producer in the US. Our products are used around the world to help build the infrastructure that makes our daily lives possible. We help build everything from the roads and bridges that connect our communities to the foundation and roofs used to build homes and commercial buildings. At Lafarge-Holcim, we like to say that the future is not written, it's built. And we want to build it in a way that works for both people and the planet. This means that we have to build things in a more resilient and sustainable way. Next slide, please. So why are we here? As Laura mentioned, natural disasters are growing in frequency and strength. We recorded $22 billion events last year. That shatters the previous annual record of 16 that occurred in 2016. I also like to point out that 2020 was also the sixth consecutive year in which 10 or more billion-dollar weather events have impacted the United States. Next slide. Can investing in infrastructure really help? The short answer is yes. And as we've covered in the panel, and we'll cover more in the Q&A, we'll talk a little bit about why investing in resiliency actually helps save money in the long run. But first, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the pictures up on the screen. The pictures above highlight damages caused by the historic floods in Colorado in 2013. The pictures hit home for me because I was a young congressional staffer working for Senator Mark Udall of Colorado in 2013. Part of my legislative responsibilities at the time was overseeing FEMA and FEMA policy. So my job turned from overseeing legislative matters to working on the ground with the agency and impacted communities to help rebuild. One of the most frustrating things at the time was that FEMA had very little flexibility when it came to incorporating resiliency into its rebuilding efforts. They would often tell you that we could only provide a like-for-like replacement using outdated building codes, and they could not afford or pay for upgrades. FEMA offered us pre-disaster mitigation funds and post-disaster mitigation funds through other avenues other than the disaster relief fund, but the funds were all oftentimes very limited and did not allow us to really prepare for the disasters that we knew could come in the future. Sadly, the story is not unique to Colorado. We've seen it play out over and over again, from areas impacted by wildfires in California to areas impacted by hurricanes like Puerto Rico. But there is something we can do. Next slide. Investing in resilient infrastructure saves money. Investing and updating building codes can help resilient infrastructure help generate $13 for every $1 we invest. From a federal government perspective, and this is something that I like to talk to my congressional colleagues about all the time, is that for every dollar the federal government invests in mitigation, it saves $6 in the long run, not having to replace crumbling infrastructure or infrastructure damage by natural disasters. Next slide. Poor infrastructure impacts us all. It's not just communities prone to wildfires or communities on the eastern or western seaboard that are impacted by hurricanes or floods. We all pay the price when we fail to invest in infrastructure. Poor conditions cost the average motorist $324 in a year to repair additional vehicle repairs. Each year, U.S. drivers lose 5.5 billion hours sitting in congestion, and more than 2.9 billion gallons of gas are wasted idling. These numbers are outdated, and I did that on purpose. These numbers are from 2015, as our friends at ASSE covered. The numbers have only gone up, and I wanted to bring the 2015 numbers to highlight how much those numbers have increased and how much they're likely to continue to increase unless we invest in infrastructure. Next slide. I was asked to provide a little bit of context of what resiliency could look like in real life. Again, because we often think of infrastructure, we don't often think of infrastructure. We drive, we use community hospitals, community buildings, but it's often not at the forefront of our minds. So I want to highlight 3 projects that Lafarge Wholesome played a role in that I think could help put this into perspective. This is the Pulaski Skyway Bridge in northern New Jersey. In 2012, it was in need of a new deck. The New Jersey Department of Transportation wanted to minimize traffic disruptions and future deck maintenance. So, working with our engineers at Ductile, the Department of Transportation managed to create a system to replace the Skyway deck with precast concrete panels connected with ultra high performance concrete. This system minimized the need to construct the deck, the time needed to construct the deck, and maximize the quality of the deck. With this investment, the new deck would not have to field repairs for the next 75 years compared to a traditional 50-year construction bridge, therefore minimizing maintenance and future traffic disruptions in the future. Next slide. For all your homeowners, we've made incredible technological advancements in insulation materials over the last couple of decades. One of those materials is spray foam that our company Firestone Building Products helps manufacture. And spray foam insulation can act as an air barrier, preventing air leakage and sealing cracks and gaps around the home. Air leakage wastes up to 40% of the energy used to heat and cool a single family home. As you can see in the picture, there's a lot of ways for air to filter through gaps and leaks in and out of the house, therefore wasting more energy to maintain it hot or cold. Homes with spray foam insulation can save 5,637 kilowatt hours per year. This can save the average American $743. Next slide. Lastly, one of the other nice structures that I wanted to highlight where resiliency kind of can meet a gray and green solution, as we've started to talk about here at the top of the panel, is green roofs. Green roofs are the roofs that you'll see sometimes in large commercial buildings that have vegetation at the top. And this added vegetation helps reduce energy costs by absorbing heat and providing natural insulation for buildings. Green roofs also remove air particulates, produce oxygen, and provide shade. Green roofs also help reduce and slow stormwater runoff in urban environments. They also help protect against ice buildup during the winter. With careful plant selection, sufficient drainage, and adequate structural support, vegetated roofs can help be resilient both in winter and for droughts in the summer. The systems conserve energy, mitigate urban heat, and prolong the overall service life of the roofing material, which again is an added savings to the consumer. I hope you'll find these real life examples illuminating. And next slide. And with that, we'll turn it over back to Laura for questions and further discussion on the topic. Thank you.
Thanks, Leo, so much for offering your perspective from a company that's contributing the materials that can help build resilient infrastructure. We really appreciate it. So just a reminder to please submit any questions you may have in the Q&A function. And I will start off with some of my own questions. As someone who works in resilience, I'm happy to have time with you all to ask. First, sort of thinking a little bit more about the how of resilience, could you all dig a little bit more into how we make existing infrastructure more resilient and how that compares to incorporating resilience into the design phase of a new project?
I can jump in with some thoughts there, Laura. I'll build on actually one thing that Emily touched on earlier in her presentation is I think one way to make existing infrastructure resilient right off the bat is having good data and information about that infrastructure. There's a lot of cities throughout the US that actually don't, at the current state, have a really good grasp on all of the infrastructure that's out within their city, or if they do, potentially it's not digitized. And getting that type of baseline data and understanding can then help you make better investment decisions as you move forward, which has direct resilience benefits as well as just benefits for general fiscal and operations of a city.
I'd be happy to add on to that one. I mean, I think, yes, you do have a few more options at your disposal if you can think about new infrastructure in the design phase, and that's everything from, you know, where you're siting the assets that you're building to what materials you're using. You know, are you thinking through not just the design but the O&M? What's your operations and maintenance plan for the life cycle of that asset? Those types of things. But there is a lot we can do to make existing infrastructure more resilient. Obviously, resilience improves as infrastructure is more capable of withstanding or recovering from disruption. So if we're talking about the grid, that's, you know, building in some redundancy there. Again, you know, looking into the wastewater treatment systems, if they're vulnerable to extreme weather events like hurricanes that cause those power outages, you know, looking at their redundant power sources or hardening some of those assets so that they're resilient to both extremes, I think makes a lot of sense. Perhaps looking at levees and inland waterways, looking at land use planning around those adjacent communities to dams and levees is important. And finally, we've seen a lot of good work happening with ports, with storm surge and sea level rise. You know, they're making the equipment in the terminals more portable, getting better access to some of those modal connectors, and building in some of that flexibility and ability to quickly adapt and change are some things we can do with existing assets.
Yeah, Laura, I'll just add, I started to talk a little bit about during my presentation is, you know, making sure we update building codes to recognize new technological advancement and new materials. Oftentimes we'll have a new material on the market for a number of years and we'll talk to engineers and they'll love the product and what it can do in terms of resiliency, in terms of energy efficiency. But even they will face pushback because they'll be building something and the specifier community will say, well, great, that's a great product, but we're comfortable with this traditional cement, concrete, so if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So we need to find a better way of providing that data and working with the specifier community to recognize that there are new technological advancements, there are new products that could help build better infrastructure for the community and the planet.
Great, thank you. And pulling a little more on that theme, Emily, you mentioned of adaptability. I'm wondering if we could dive a little bit more into, you know, how we, given the uncertainty with emissions and what our future looks like in the range of sea level rise, et cetera, how do we really make our infrastructure investments now adaptable to the range of conditions that we might see in the future?
Again, as Leo mentioned, I mean, I think relying on some of those codes and standards can help, and making sure the ones that we have are utilized and updating them with the best data when it's available makes a lot of sense. And I do think, yeah, being comfortable with uncertainty is hard, especially, you know, I'll say in the engineering community. If you're dealing with drinking water systems, there might be some risk aversion to doing a pilot with a new technology or material or process because you're dealing with, you know, life safety issues. So what can we do to get more creative and flexible while also making sure that we're keeping safety first and foremost? And I think a similar theme is related to procurement. And I'm not an expert on procurement, but I do know that's a barrier that we're facing of When you do have a new material or a new way of doing things, are the DOTs or utilities, et cetera, allowed to purchase in a different way or deviate from what they've been doing traditionally? That's also going to take some effort, as tedious as an issue as it sounds. Opens up a lot of doors when we can change that process.
Emily, I'm no expert on procurement either, but I have spent a lot of time looking into that topic because 40% of cement produced in the United States is actually tied to public works projects. So our folks are in the procurement space all the time. So in just talking to them, you could really see how the federal government, through this massive investment in infrastructure and just their general use of infrastructure, can really move a market. If the federal government put higher standards, a buy clean standard to buy low carbon products, the industry would be forced to innovate. We're already there. We're looking to develop and deploy more low carbon products, but we want everyone in the industry to come along.
Yeah, and in addition to procurement, and Emily, you touched a little bit on the building codes piece. I'm curious for all three of you, what you think lawmakers should be building into this new legislation that will help ensure that taxpayer dollars are spent on resilience projects. What are your priorities there?
I just started to talk about it. For us, a buy clean standard, something that incentivizes the use of low carbon products, would really be a game changer, since a lot of cement is tied to public works. Legislators should also take a step back and look at doing a true life cycle cost analysis of materials being used for construction. Sometimes localities are forced to go with the lowest available bid, not the best available bid. And what I mean by that is sometimes it could be cheaper to do a bridge, for example, for 20 years than an investment to make it 50 years. But when you add up the 30 years of additional maintenance and traffic disruptions and possible impact to commerce and travel and tourism, the numbers really start to add up. So not looking at just the lowest available bid, but the best available bid.
And Laura, I would love to see integrated into it some really clear performance metrics for the different types of investments that they're trying to push forward. So what I mean by that is, if you're going to be getting funds for this, we want you to be able to define clearly what are the key performance indicators you're going to be expecting to achieve through that work. I think what that can do is that can not only kind of help to what Leo was talking about around, making sure we're looking at the best projects, but I also think it helps people really articulate the value they're trying to get out of what they're doing and taking that more holistic view.
I would add, a lot of great points by both Katrina and Leo. Absolutely life cycle cost analysis. We'd like to see more building on that, either as an incentive or kind of a requirement for some of these grants moving forward. Because yes, we're building and designing things to last 100 years or more. But in this era of very constrained budgets, which will continue, it is tempting, and often the way things go, to just look at that ribbon cutting cost, that upfront cost, and not the full life cycle of an asset. Again, any kind of incentives or grant criteria that encourage the use of consensus-based standards. And then I think, especially for our smaller systems, our smaller communities and utilities out there, some technical training, some grants, so that, that can be anything from how to create a meaningful asset management plan, to, perhaps the use of some technology that's already out there, but can lower the cost of projects, for example, drones for inspections and things like that.
Yeah, and Katrina, I wanted to ask a little bit more about green infrastructure, since you talked about those great projects that incorporate it in local settings. We hear a lot about how it's a really great option for resilience. It can be lower costs than gray infrastructure. It offers many co-benefits from air quality to water quality to recreation, as you mentioned. So why do you think green infrastructure isn't used perhaps as much as it should be as a resilient option? Could you talk a little bit more about the barriers there and perhaps how the federal level could better support building green infrastructure?
Yes, I know one key barrier we hear a lot, especially from municipal clients, is the operation and maintenance side. So there's designing the site and getting it built, and that seems to be, people are all on board, pretty straightforward. But there become concerns with who is the maintenance and operations handed over to. Are the staff of those departments properly trained to do that, or do they have to do additional training? And does it add, change their existing processes? So I think there's definitely both a fear associated with that, and there are some real barriers of changing the way that you're doing something to manage those sites. And I think that's as much of a culture change conversation within city governments as it is an actual technology solution. But I do see that as a frequent barrier in the conversation around green infrastructure investments. And as far as how the federal government may be able to support in that space, I mean, there could be, not just the grants up front for the actual construction, but are there ways in which they can support, a couple years of the operation and maintenance of the site, or some additional training for staff as, entities are either making that transition, or for the example of the projects I went through in Chicago, there were actually training community partners to help be stewards of the site and help with some of the site maintenance. So potentially there could be some integration of funds there to test out some different models to overcome that barrier.
Yeah, Leo or Emily, any other thoughts on sort of the transition to green infrastructure and incorporating gray with green as a balance, maybe to get us to that point to be using it more where it's appropriate?
Yeah, I think sometimes simple things like making sure that green infrastructure is eligible for funding and changing some of those eligibility requirements we've seen good movement in that direction, and I think that'll continue because for a lot of communities, the green infrastructure solution will make sense. So that's just one kind of low-hanging fruit that I see. And then I guess, to your earlier question of what would you like to see in an infrastructure plan, just so it doesn't go unsaid, I think, it's clear we're going to need more funding. We're going to need to grow the pie and to make some of these investments. And these are investments that last. They have a great ROI. We're in a moment, coming out of, as we look to economic recovery, where if you want to create good jobs, set up a strong foundation for economic recovery and really prepare our communities for the future, investing in infrastructure makes the most sense.
Yeah, absolutely, Emily. And, from LaFarge-Holzer's perspective, green and gray are not competitors. They often need to work together to design the best available system to serve communities. One of the things that I've looked at is, flexibility at the Army Corps. Don't get me wrong, we want to use cement to build dams and bridges, but there are areas in the country where the Army Corps needs that flexibility to properly site a wetland or a marsh expansion with that dam or in lieu of the dam. And giving that a flexibility to the folks on the ground, I think is important and something that should be looked at in this infrastructure package.
Yeah, and thinking more about the American Jobs Plan, obviously a central element of it is job creation. So I'm curious if you could talk about, Emily, across types of infrastructure, and Katrina and Leo in your sectors, how incorporating resilience into projects can actually create jobs as well as offer that broader economic benefit.
Yeah, I'll take a stab at that. Or from the construction and building materials space, retrofitting buildings and building new roads and bridges is going to create jobs for the building materials manufacturing, for the construction, for roofing. I think adopting new building codes and standards can also help spur research and innovation, which will lead to new product creation and also new jobs in research and development.
Yeah, again, to lift those grades out of the D's, we've got a lot of work to do. So I think as we look to build back better and make our infrastructure more resilient, it is a job creator. And one sector we haven't talked a lot about yet, but looking at the grid, one thing we pointed out in our Failure to Act economic series is to meet the ambitious goals that we have for a transition to renewables, which we pretty much take at this point as a given. We need transmission lines to connect. They're almost like the extension cords to connect to distribution networks. So there's a lot of jobs incorporated throughout multiple infrastructure sectors when it comes to making our infrastructure more.
Katrina, I think you're on mute still.
I had myself on double mute. Sorry for that. I was just adding on that. There's many economic studies that just demonstrate that investing in infrastructure creates jobs. I think one thing that would be really great to look at through this job plan, though, is how can we create jobs in places where they're most needed? So looking at, how can it not just be building resilience from an infrastructure perspective, but how can this investment and influx of funds and jobs in building infrastructure actually create jobs for marginalized or disadvantaged communities? And so I think that's where getting creative and thinking about the way you're structuring the distribution of funds or the types of requirements on it can make it do more than, it can also enhance community resilience, not just infrastructure resilience through these investments.
Yeah, and that's a great segue to my next question. A key component, as you all have seen, of the president's plan is a focus on environmental justice and ensuring that more communities are considered when we're thinking about infrastructure resilience at a minimum, and hopefully, including their voices in the process. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about how resilient infrastructure you think can provide benefits to marginalized communities. Katrina, you just mentioned the job creation piece, and how infrastructure projects can be designed to be more inclusive, to incorporate their voices in planning, design, et cetera, processes.
Yeah, great question, Laura. I talked a little bit about this during my presentation, but the use of new building materials can help increase energy efficiency and save money for the American consumer. For the average family, saving $700 just because their house is built to a better code with better building materials. It costs them nothing. That's one of the elements that we're looking closely from the president's plan to retrofit and build 2 million new affordable houses. We want to make sure that they're built with the best available materials that are going to increase not only their energy efficiency, but their resiliency over time. And that providing a good quality home to Americans and leads to jobs both in the construction industry and in savings long-term that can provide jobs further down in the economy. In terms of engaging voices, I think that's a very good topic and something that we need to do a better job of. At Lafarge Wholesome, I help oversee our community advisory groups, or all our operations, try to meet with our surrounding neighborhoods and talk to them about our operation and things that may be impacting them. Some have highlighted, hey, you have a lot of trucks coming on, there's dust. So we've worked with them to implement water filtration systems that keep the dust down. But in terms of construction, we are a provider of building materials, not necessarily the builder of the building. But in talking to construction engineers and talking to general contractors, one thing I've found is they're willing to make changes if you come in early at the design process. There are changes that can be made to design routes, to the height of bridges to minimize noise. There's a variety of things that can be made, but it's about early engagement between the developer and the community, and working together, we can build the future that we need for tomorrow.
Yeah, and I would say, I think I like where this conversation is going, because I think there's just a growing recognition that all these projects are about people, and infrastructure investments are really opportunities to benefit communities, and it's about quality of life. So, we'll see what comes out in the actual package, but just with the Justice 40 executive order, you've seen some good thoughts around how to make sure, studies have shown that vulnerable communities are the ones hit by routine flooding and air pollution, and get hit over and over. And how can we create better opportunities for those communities? And I'm still looking through a report that just came out. The White House has this Environmental Justice Council that is starting to look through and came up with a series of recommendations around, okay, how do we implement Justice 40 to get benefits to those communities? What are some tangible examples of what that looks like as the agencies, try to figure out what that means for their program? So I saw some programs highlighted, such as green roofs, porous pavements, all of the things that are relatively ways to mitigate some of those impacts. And I think, as Leo said, it's also just about listening. You can do the bare minimum with environmental impact statements and do a public meeting and put up a poster board and be done with it, or you can go out into the community and talk to them about what this project means, what it's going to mean to their quality of life, hopefully in a positive way, and make sure that you're being equitable in how you design and cite some of these major investments. So I think we've seen some good cues and signals that there's going to be a lot more listening and an early engagement.
Yeah, Emily, I couldn't agree more. And I would add that during that listening, I think it's really about making people understand, and both from the designer perspective and the community perspective, that an infrastructure investment can be more than just its surface value, right? It really is about providing benefit to the community. So a transportation-based project can have stormwater management benefits, and really looking for those opportunities to use the same set of funding or money that you have to do more with it. So build that road, but also integrate some of that green stormwater infrastructure along the median. And all of a sudden you're solving two community problems at once. So looking for those opportunities and listening to the communities to understand where those intersections might be is a really valuable way that this work could have impacts on communities.
Great. Yeah. Thank you for offering those perspectives, as I know a lot of organizations are working to, increase their consideration for marginalized communities and the lens with which they approach infrastructure work and climate policy work generally. I want to talk a little bit more about funding sources for resilient infrastructure that could go towards infrastructure projects in low-income communities in particular. Folks on the call might be familiar with the FEMA BRIC program, Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities. It's a new program that FEMA started in 2018, and it really presents a much larger amount of pre-disaster hazard mitigation funding that's available for states and cities to implement projects across the hazards that we're seeing as a result of climate change. The program so far in its first year seems to be pretty popular. They had applications totaling nearly $3.6 billion for this first round. And I think those awarded projects will be announced soon. So I'm curious from any of you what your thoughts on the program are as a potentially game changer program for resilience projects across infrastructure and communities, and how you think it might be improved, whether it's through the American Jobs Plan or other legislation.
So I'm very excited to see FEMA making this change from pre-disaster mitigation. I think one of my frustrations when I was a congressional staffer, particularly around the HMGP program, the Hazard Mitigation Grant program and a lot of FEMA programs is they're only accessible when you qualify for a national disaster declaration under the Stafford Act. And the Stafford Act sets the disaster criteria in a wonky methodology that says cost of damages plus cost of people impacted divided by total number of people, and there's a threshold, and you have to meet that threshold to qualify for Stafford. If you don't get a lot of access to FEMA resources. And that needs to change. In the area that I highlighted when I worked on was wildfires. Wildfires, because oftentimes, unless they're a wildfire in California, the damage is severe to the land, but not necessarily to properties or people. In states like Colorado, you can have a wildfire burn for thousands of acres without touching homes or impacting minimal homes, that therefore doesn't qualify for Stafford designation. And the problem without having access to Stafford funds and to disaster relief fund is you can't use mitigation dollars. And if you know anything about wildfires, is that the disaster happens twice. One is with the wildfire and one is with the soil erosion that happens that leads to landslides. And for us in the roads and bridge community, those landslides end up breaking down those roads and bridges. And we want to be able to build them stronger and better and more resilient to account for that possible soil erosion in the future.
That was a good staffer perspective, having been on both sides. And I think, look, our members were really excited about this program. I think we held a webinar, as soon as we heard, with FEMA representatives and had record-breaking attendance, because it's not often you have a program with new funding, and was pleased to see in the American Jobs Plan that there's proposal to boost that funding even more. But it'll be interesting to see what's chosen, but there does seem to be an element of added flexibility and recognition that, following a disaster, we can't just rebuild exactly the same way we've done. It makes sense to be a little bit more creative up front. And we did like the incentives as part of the criteria to use consensus-based standards as well. So a lot of excitement in the industry around the promise of BRIC. And I'm sure with each iteration, there'll be some lessons learned and perhaps some tweaks.
All right. I think we will turn to audience questions now. We have gotten quite a few, so thanks everyone for submitting. First, for Katrina, your work focuses on the local level. How are people on the ground perceiving making infrastructure resilient, and is there a difference in how federal policymakers are considering how resilience should be incorporated into projects?
That's a great question. So I think on the local level, a lot of the things you've already touched on, I think people really are starting to see building resilient infrastructure as a community issue. It's a thing that impacts communities and has an opportunity to really address challenges that communities have been facing for years. Things like urban flooding, poor air quality, the list goes on and on. So I think at the local level, it's always kind of been framed, or not always, but, in the last 5 years or so, the conversation's really been framed, in that lens. And at the federal level, one thing I'm seeing with the American Jobs Act is that it seems to be shifting to that framing as well, which I think is a really great shift. So I'd like to see that continue, that kind of idea that the investments we're making should be impacting communities, and not just communities generally, but really targeted communities or communities that have historically been marginalized or disadvantaged. So I think that could be a really great kind of synergy or bringing together across from the federal level down to the local level and the impacts there.
Great, thank you. And I have a question for Emily. From someone who is a former civil engineer who knows sustainability can be a taboo topic in certain groups. How do you educate and encourage, quote, old school engineers to support climate resiliency efforts?
It's a good question. I mean, I think the language that we use, can sometimes be a little different depending on the audience that you're speaking with. But I just anecdotally have some good examples of, especially when we're talking about making infrastructure more resilient, it makes economic sense. And so even our more old school engineers recognize that we don't want to be, and again, in this very constrained budget environment, we do not want to be wasting funds on designing, rebuilding infrastructure that's just going to get hit with a hurricane or a new wind load or et cetera. So I think when we just, use language that resonates with people, talk about it in financial terms, but overall within the AAC community, this is a topic they just want to hear more and more about. Anything that we post in our newsletter, webinars that we do on sustainable infrastructure and best practices and the work that Katrina is doing, I mean, they just want to hear more and more about it. So, I mean, I think, yes, there are exceptions, but as a whole, the industry is moving in this direction.
Yeah, thank you. And for Leo, how are other countries building resilience into infrastructure, and how does that compare, you think, to the US? Emily, you also touched a little bit on the differences. Is it infrastructure spending that's really the difference, or are there specific policies that you see driving these efforts?
Sure. So it depends on what country. I saw in the chat that somebody was asking about Africa, and this came across my desk here at Lafarge. How we're working through 14 Trees, a Lafarge-Holcim joint venture, in developing 3D printing technology to build affordable, low carbon housing at scale in Africa. Using this 3D printing technology that we're piloting right now, we're able to optimize the speed of construction and the use of materials and reduce the carbon footprint of building new homes by up to 70%.
Yeah, I mean, I might add, we get this question quite a bit of, are we ranking our compared to other countries with the report card? And we are not. We are grading against ourselves and where we think we should be as a country. And I know there's other groups like the World Economic Forum that rank how the US compares for infrastructure, modernization, and investment. And we've dropped to something like 13. But yeah, I think, there's issues in developing countries on basic need maintenance and repair. We can point to other countries. I've heard a lot of discussion in the policy realm on, does the US have a national vision for infrastructure? And could we look to Canada and some of our peers that have, for example, have a national port strategy? And do we have that vision, that big, bold vision for where we want to be as a country? Or are we more of a patchwork system where we leave it to the states and cities to make those investments? So I'm not sure I answered the questions, but that's some of the discussion I hear around where we compare.
And we have a question that came in that relates to some work that C2ES did recently, looking at the link between economic competitiveness and climate resilience. Our question writer says, it is pretty clear that bond rating agencies and bond holders are relying more and developing more sophisticated bond rating systems for ESG performance. Will the communities that are not building sustainably and resiliently be left behind, in your opinions?
That's a good question, Laura. I can tell you that from Lafarge-Holcim's perspective, our ability to attract capital is very much tied to our ESG rating. People want to invest in Lafarge-Holcim because they view how we're taking sustainability and using it as a market driver, that we're building for the future. So it makes it easier for us. would venture to guess that across our industry, yeah, there's going to be companies that are going to have a harder time attracting capital and growing and will be left behind unless they take ESG seriously.
Just another thing to keep on the radar with what they're tracking is just basic asset management. And we did a webinar yesterday for our own members on what cities were doing when it came to asset management. And Washington, D.C. has a great example of they improved their bond rating when they came up with a robust asset management plan and pay-fors. And kind of the first step of being resilient in a lot of ways is knowing what you have. Getting an inventory and then knowing the condition that it's in. So somewhat related.
Yeah, and this next question could be for all three of you, but I think Katrina will have some thoughts on it. How do we focus on upgrading existing infrastructure and developing sustainable and green infrastructure without triggering gentrification of neighborhoods and pricing urban communities out of their homes?
Yes, that is a crux of a lot of the work that we do. And if I had the perfect succinct answer, I would be writing a book and, out signing copies on that or something. But, I'll give some thoughts, or at least what we see. I mean, I think one step in the process is, and not to sound like a broken record, but really working with the community from the beginning so that you can kind of understand some of those challenges or fears. I also think there's a component of policy support in making the investments and working to try to make sure you're preserving and investing in additional low income or affordable housing within areas that you're making these investments in. So I don't have the perfect answer. It is something that we talk about and think about with a lot of our projects, especially the green infrastructure or the type of work where we're maybe expanding a trail system, because you hear a lot of those stories of the gentrification that it brings in. So revitalization without gentrification is a real challenge and something that we need to continue to keep in mind and talk about so that we can develop specific solutions that can be tailored to the communities we're working in.
Yeah, just speaks to the importance of community engagement throughout the process, more so than just checking the box of having the community meeting, et cetera. I'm curious, this is another good question we got. When experiencing pushback, political, economic, or otherwise, to the development of green infrastructure and expansion of sustainable infrastructure, what options do planners and engineers have to push resilience projects forward?
Depends on who they're pushing for or against. If it's a business to business, you can talk to them about the long-term cost savings, the true life cycle cost analysis. If it's political, you can talk about the cost savings of disaster mitigation or reliability. So I think it very much depends on the audience, but again, green and gray can coexist and can coexist very well and work collectively for the betterment of everyone.
I'll just echo what Leo said. I think whenever we approach any of our projects where we're trying to push a new technology, advance a new technology or something that's more sustainable or resilient, the first question we always ask is, well, who's the audience and how does the message have to be tailored to each individual audience? Because it likely won't be the same. But we do tend to find that there is a way to have that conversation. It's just making sure you're having the conversation they want to have, not the conversation you want to have. And that can tend to help kind of advance the overall.
Agreed. And yeah, this is more general advice, but I started my career in public involvement and, the best team of engineers has a communicator also behind them. And sometimes the basic question of, I think as Katrina was saying, what's in it for me? Thinking through how you're communicating the benefits of the program you're unveiling, what it's going to mean for them. And in ways that resonate, because community buy-in, political buy-in, for whatever you're trying to do is absolutely essential.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks for your thoughts there. And I think a great question to end on will be, are there any suggestions that you would have on how we could develop improved communities of practice for sharing some of the ideas that we've talked about today, lessons learned, or ways to leverage knowledge and resources on incorporating resilience into infrastructure?
I have one, and it goes to transparency and consumer awareness. And that is just for major construction projects. There's something called an environmental product declaration, or EPD. And if you don't know what that is, completely fine. Just look at a nutrition label that you see on the side of a cereal box that has the contents. We develop EPDs for a wide variety of construction materials. We have them for all our cement plants, and they will tell you our global warming potential. And we've started to see the market ask for those and actually start making investment decisions and project selection and selecting products with the lowest global warming potential. So as you're considering building, start thinking of how you can incorporate sustainability and resiliency, and asking your building materials, your contractors, what they can bring to the table, because that's going to force them to have that conversation and not just go back to say, okay, well, here's what the standard book says, and let's just follow the standards book. If the customer starts to demand change, industry will react to it.
I just think, this virtual world we're living in, one of the benefits is being able to share best practices and lessons learned and connect with colleagues and experts from across the country without having to hop on a plane or be in an exhibit hall has been kind of a silver lining, right? And when we released our report card in March, traditionally we'd done something in DC. This time we did a 6-hour solution summit and had about 5,000 people sign up. So I think working with organizations like C2ES and your associations and finding people in your field or new fields you want to learn about, and just, connecting through the discussion boards or suggesting peer-to-peer exchanges. There's a lot we can do now that we couldn't before.
And there doesn't seem to be a shortage of ongoing events like this. So I would just encourage, not just the C2ES, but just generally, I think I get sent another resilience or sustainability related conversation that I could join multiple times a week. So I think just continuing to look for those on the internet, there's lots of great places to join conversations like this.
Thank you, everyone, so much for your inputs, and we're glad to be participating and contribute in this discussion and take advantage of this infrastructure opportunity that we haven't really had before, and how do we make our assets last and serve our communities better into the future. So I want to thank everyone for joining us, and for our excellent panelists for your thoughts, for our practitioner and policy guests today. I also want to plug several upcoming webinars that we have planned, one on green banks, which in part can be used to fund resilience projects, and another on clean procurement. More information on these webinars can be found at c2es.org. All right. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a good day.